Coming from the north, it is so good to be here in Texas, where people are friendly. I mean, let's just be honest. And yeah. And people understand what grits are, okay? Because in Michigan, somebody asked me one time, hey, what is a grit? And I was like, it's not singular. You don't get one grit. It's anyway. But I'm not from Michigan. I actually grew up in Cincinnati. So it's kind of the north and the, thank you very much. It's kind of the north and the south rolled up into one perfect city. Anyway, that's where I grew up. And it's got Skyline chili there. Has anybody had Skyline chili? Nobody? Okay, a couple people. Good. It'll bless you. It's a spiritual experience. And I love Skyline chili and Grater's ice cream and everything. And it's a home of the St. Xavier Bombers. Nobody. Okay, it's where I went to high school, and I played football for the St. Xavier Bombers. And I tell you what, a lot of people don't like high school. They had rough years and that sort of thing. High school was the best 6 years of my life, okay? I mean, I loved it. And one day, when I was in the lunchroom, I looked across the lunchroom, and the crowd parted, and here was this girl on the other end of the lunchroom, and she was beautiful. And being the mature ninth grader that I was, I asked my friend to go ask her friend to ask her if maybe she was digging my chili the way I was digging her chili. And sure enough, the word came back that she was. And so I wrote one of those notes. And again, it's not like I was in middle school where I wrote that note. You know that note that said, do you like me? Circle one, yes or no. I was so beyond that. I said, do you like me? If so, meet me out on the practice field before football practice. Did I mention she was a cheerleader? Yes. Anyway, so I was going through my whole day. I had no clue what to expect. At the end of the day, I'm putting on my cleats. I'm putting on my pads. I go out to the practice field, and there she was. It was great. I couldn't believe it. I kind of expected you to applaud on that. I mean, this was a life-changing experience for me. And I walk up to this girl and I'm like, hey, what's up? You know, that sort of thing. And we decided to go on a romantic walk together around the sports track. And we were holding hands. I grabbed her hand, not like this, but like this, because you know that makes all the difference. And so as we're walking around the sports track, there were these two guys that came from the neighborhood next door, and they walked out. Now, these guys were older. They were shaving. And there were two of them. And just one of me, and they started giving me a hard time and giving Stephanie a hard time, and I had a decision to make. Am I going to, stick up for what's right? Am I going to be bold? Am I going to be, somebody that does the right thing, or am I going to cower in the face of crazy odds? And so I said, hey, you can't talk to me that way. This is a lady, you can't talk to her that way, but that didn't stop them. They just kept coming. Now, if you can run away from a fight, you should, but sometimes you can't, all right? And so what you do, guys, I don't know if you, is you do the dance, all right? And the dance goes like this. You get up in the guy's face, and you put your chest out, and he puts his chest out, and you put your hands down like this. You cock your head to the side, and then you go like this. You know, this kind of deal. And so we're doing the dance with one guy, and his friend, I didn't know, went behind me and knelt down. Now, we were at the top of a hill with a fence at the bottom. And suddenly, without me knowing it, the guy that I'm doing the dance with pushes me, and my foot goes back to catch myself, but I feel that guy back there. I can't get back there. So what I do is I make a split decision to jump backwards, do a handspring, back handspring, and I came out going, ah. Do you believe that's what happened? All right, well then I'll tell you what really happened, because I basically fell down, rolled down the hill, and smacked my head against that fence. And it was about that time that I thought maybe I made a mistake. You know. Well, let me ask you a question. What do you think gave me the confidence, the boldness, not to be so stressed, but to go up against these guys? Well, I'll tell you what it was. About the time my head hit that fence, I looked over, and outside the practice room, do you remember I told you this was right before, a little earlier, right before football practice? Right when my head hit that fence, my team had seen the whole thing from the locker room, and they ran a sea of blue and white jerseys out to take care of me. And did these two guys, stand up to great odds, or did they were just chickens and they ran away, right? And that, my friends, is the story of my chivalry. All right? Now, the reason I ask that question, or I tell you that story, is because I want to ask you a question. If you really believe that God had your back, like my team I knew had my back, how would it change the way you lived your life? If you really believe God was with you all the time, how would it change the confidence that you have in life? How would it change the worry and the stress? How would it change the joy? Would you take greater risks because you knew God had your back? Would you stand up for what was right in a more bold way because you knew that God was right there? In the Old Testament, the story of the Israelites was one where God seemed far off to them. He was always hanging out on the mountaintops. He wouldn't speak to individuals, but he would only speak through leaders or prophets. And God just sort of seemed to those Old Testament folks as though he were far off. In fact, there was a time after the prophets and right before the New Testament called the intertestamental period. And it was 400 years. And during that time, there were no miracles. There was no prophets. There were no God. God was silent for 400 years. Do you ever feel like God's not close? Do you ever wonder, does he really have my back? Do you ever think, man, why is God silent in my life right now, this day, this week, this season of my life? My daughter was probably 3-4 years old, and she was throwing a ball up into the air, and she was catching it every time. And as a dad, I was so proud, but she was frustrated. And I said, honey, why are you so frustrated? And she said, God won't catch it. Don't you love that? And then she started asking me questions. Where's God? Why can't we see him? Those are tough questions to answer as a dad. Can you imagine an Israelite dad during the 400-year intertestamental period where God is silent and there's no saying to his kid, hey, we got to stick up for what's right? Well, why, Dad? Well, because remember God and Moses and the Red Sea and all the plagues, and you remember all that stuff? And Dad, that was 400 years ago. And there's been no prophets, and no angels, and no miracles for 400 years until one night an angel appears to a little peasant girl, probably no more than 13, 14 years old, and then very quickly appearing to her beloved Joseph. And that angel said these words, the words that they needed to hear. A people that felt like God was far off, that wondered, does he really have our back? The angel said the words that they needed to hear in Matthew 1:23. It said, behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. He is with you. And when you believe that God is with you, that Jesus, you can have a personal relationship with him, and that he can live in your heart, and that he can make a difference in your world, well, that just changes everything. I mean, there are far-reaching implications for that. Now, I don't have time for all of them, but let me just give you a couple of implications. When you really believe, not just here, but here, that God is with you, the first one is, well, actually kind of scary. Because if God is with me, then that means every time we blow it, God knows it. And that's a sobering truth. I had somebody send me an email with a foreword, and you could read it. It was the world's dumbest criminals. And I don't like to make fun of people from the stage, but I think we can all make fun of dumb crooks, right? So there was this one guy, Jamie O'Donnell, and he steals a car, actually in Austin, Texas. And he takes off up north, and at some point, he picks up a hitchhiker. And they continue up north, and somewhere in Virginia, they decide that they're going to take a break, and Jamie goes in to grab a drink. When he comes back out, the car is gone. The hitchhiker had stolen the car from Jamie. And so Jamie decides the smart thing to do is to call the cops and report him. And he does, and the cops get him, and they end up getting Jamie, and you look at that and you go, dumb criminal, right? Two men tried to take an ATM machine. They were going to yank it off of its foundation, drag it home, and then open it up. So what they do is they back their pickup truck to it. They take this big old chain, wrap it around the ATM machine, wrap it around their bumper, and they floor it. And as the truck takes off, the ATM doesn't, and it yanks the bumper right off the truck. The two criminals get so afraid that they just drive home, leaving the ATM attached to the chain, attached to the bumper, attached to the license plate. Dumb criminals. And you're reading this thing, and there were more stories, and I was just going, man, how dumb are these guys? Don't they know that eventually they're going to get caught? And then it hit me. If God is with me, there is no place where I blow it. You know, maybe I think no one else is looking, but there is no place where God is not looking. Maybe I think to myself, you know, when you run errands on company time, or you tell your wife, I just got caught up in traffic, or these little things that sometimes we're tempted to do. Not you guys, but the church down the street. You know, that you're tempted to do these things. If there is a church down the street, I apologize. But we think no one's looking, or we'll spread a little bit of gossip, or we'll pocket some work supplies, and we'll think, that's not a big deal. But guess what? It is a big deal. Hebrews 4:13 says, nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. I grew up in church. I was a church kid, and they taught us this little song. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little eyes, what you see, for the Father up above is looking down with love. So be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little hands, what you do. Be careful, little hands, what you do, for the Father up above is looking down with love. So be careful, little hands, what you do. And as a 7-year-old with that song ringing in your head, when mom walks out of the room and the cookie jar is right there, you know that even though mom's not out of the room, God is still watching you. And that is a motivating truth. And the cool thing about that song is that I think it reflects the nature and the character of God that we see in Scripture, that certainly God has wrath for those that sin, but that God is not rooting for us to sin. In other words, he's not sitting back just kind of going, I can't wait for them to blow it. Remember that song said he's looking down with love. Just like you look at your kids and you say, I don't want you to go off the deep end with drugs. I don't want you to go off the deep end with not studying. I don't want you to make all these bad mistakes with premarital hand-holding, and you know what I'm talking about. And I don't want you to do all these things because I know it's going to ruin your life. And God is looking at us going, I'm rooting for you. I'm hoping that you will stay on the straight and narrow. And people think that Jesus comes along and that he's somehow soft on sin. Wasn't Jesus the one that said, hey, you've heard it said, do not commit murder, but I tell you, don't even look with anger upon someone or else you're subject to judgment. And now you've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you, if you even look with lust upon a woman, it's like you've committed adultery with her in your heart. Jesus comes along and raises the bar for sin. He says, it's not just be careful, little hands, what you do, but be careful, little mind, what you think, and be careful, little heart, what you feel. Jesus raises the bar. And God with us, Jesus with us says, you know what? I'm watching, and that should be a motivating truth, and I'm rooting for you. And guys, the reason it's motivating is because I assume you're like me. And that some days you look in the mirror and you say, you know what? I have some goals for the kind of dad I want to be for my kids. And I've got some goals for the kind of husband I want to be to my wife, and the kind of person, the kind of reputation that I'm going to have with the people that know me best. I have some goals that God dreamed me up to be a certain way. And there's something in me that says, I don't want to live with moral mediocrity. I want to be that man. And so to think that God is with me is a motivating truth. I imagine you're the same way, and that can affect what you look at night on the internet or how you do your taxes, to know that God is watching you with love. Let me give you the second one. The second one is every time we struggle, God understands it. If He's with us, then He understands us. You see, theologically speaking, He had to be both God and man so that His sacrifice on the cross was effective for the forgiveness of our sins. But the fact that He was like one of us means that He understands what we go through. That's a motivating and encouraging truth. Can I give you an absurd illustration to illustrate a profound truth? It's this. There was a guy named Steve Ruhan, and he came across a baby gorilla, of all things. Rocco is what he named him. He put the gorilla in a 10 by 10 by 10 cage, which was plenty of room for Rocco until 10 years later when he grew to be 390 pounds. Steve said, well, I got to do something about this. And so he donates him to the local zoo that had one of those habitats with the trees and the stream and all the other gorillas playing together. They brought the cage there. They opened it up and expected Rocco to take off, but Rocco ran away from the door and cowered in the corner of the cage. Because the cage is all he'd ever known. The cage is where he was comfortable. Steve Ruhan went to the zookeeper and said, gosh, what are we going to do? They're having a conversation because you don't just, it's a 390-pound gorilla. What are we going to do? About that time, Theo, another gorilla, lumbers on into the cage and sits down next to Rocco, begins having a conversation with him. I guess he was making sounds. Like gorilla sound. I imagine he said things like, hey, quit monkeying around. You're going to go bananas in here. Let's get out. But I don't know exactly what he said. Eventually, he took Rocco's hand. And then they just walked out together. You see, what Steve was unable to do because he was different, the gorilla, Theo, was able to do because he was the same. But what's my point? My point is that, and this is where the absurd becomes profound, I think, is that Jesus came into our cage. And when we're tempted to say, oh, you know what, Jesus doesn't understand, God doesn't understand what I go through, Jesus would say, well, rejected? I've been rejected. Somebody said, well, does Jesus know what it's like to be betrayed? And Jesus would say, yeah, I had a friend named Judas. And somebody would say, well, you know what, do you understand what it means to mourn the loss of a loved one? And Jesus would say, yes, I wept at Lazarus' funeral. And somebody said, well, do you know what anxiety is like and stress is like and things like that? Jesus said, hello, I didn't just sweat bullets in the garden, I sweat blood. I understand. And with Jesus understanding, Jesus even understood what it meant to be tempted. Hebrews says, for we do not have a high priest, talking about Jesus, who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. Jesus understands because He's God with us. The third and final implication I'll share with you is that because He is with us and became like us, that means every time we sacrifice for Him, God honors it. Because God is close to us, He sees every sacrifice and He honors it. I came from a church, they had a gymnasium, and one morning I came in and there were some kickballs left in the gymnasium, and I just thought, you know what, and I just kicked one, and it went shh, and I started to see the basketball goal at the other end of the gym, and sure enough, it went shoo, nothing but net. It was awesome. I mean, I went into slow motion like, this kind of thing. I'm like, should I be a professional soccer player or a professional basketball player? Because I maybe just do both. I don't know. But I was so excited, and I ran into the office, and I said to the secretary, you're not going to believe this. I just kicked the ball, went all the way into and she was like, okay, all right. And I went into a pastor's office, and I said, you're not going to believe what I did. I kicked the ball, and went in, and he was like, For real? I mean, come on, seriously? Because here's the deal. I kicked that ball in there, and no one saw it. No one saw it. And I wonder if there are times when you stay up with your child, which then ends up making you really, really tired and maybe even grumpy and not as effective at work. And you go, gosh, if you would just see what I did at home. You know what? God honors that. And somebody in here has somebody in a nursing home in their family, and you go there and you visit them, and people from the rest of your family aren't going there, and you're wondering, this is just not fair, and no one's giving me credit for this. And you know what? God honors your sacrifice. In Proverbs it says this, he who sows righteousness will reap a sure reward. Galatians 6:9 says this, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. And so every time you swallow your pride and forgive an enemy, God sees that. And every time you're in a hurry but you pause to commit an act of kindness, God sees that. And every time you'd rather relax but instead you get elbow deep in the life of someone else's trouble, or every time you'd rather sleep in, but you get up and you look at God's word. And every time you could be making big bucks, but you prioritize your family, God sees all of those things. And it's as if Jesus would put his arm around you and say, hey, he who sows in righteousness will reap a sure reward because I'm with you and I'm watching all this. I've got a story on here and I'm going to skip it and close just by saying this, that I believe there are people in this room that are probably in a cage, in a manner of speaking. That there are people in this room who feel like their addiction keeps them from real life, or a relationship that they've chosen, they feel stuck in it, or they feel caged in by what someone said about them in the past, that you'll never amount to this, or you're going to be abused, and so you've just lived as a victim in this cage. And there are moments where some pastor will come along and he'll open the cage, but because the cage is all you've ever known, you will cower away because it's comfortable in your addiction, or it's comfortable in your habit, and it's all you've ever known. But out the door, you can see people that actually have freedom and actually have joy, and people that actually have peace when they go through hard things. And you can see it out there, and you want to go out so badly. And people that actually have community, and you go, I'd love to play with those gorillas. I would love to get out there, but this is all I've ever known, and I just don't know. And can I suggest to you that God with us, Emmanuel, means that Jesus walks into your cage and extends his arm. In every excuse you have, he has an answer. In every fear you have, he has an assurance. And he says, put your hand in mine and walk with me. Come and follow me was his invitation. And for those of you who can't, there could be somebody in this room who says, you know what? I am so imprisoned. Jesus is going to have to lift me up and carry me out. And Jesus would say, not a problem. That's the invitation today, for you to follow Jesus, for you to take his hand. What would it be like in your life if you really believed, not just here, but here, that God was with you?